David Mitchell, in his 2004 novel, Cloud Atlas, wrote, "Anticipating the end of the world is humanity's oldest pastime." Most ancient religions, though, didn't believe in a definitive ending or a definitive beginning, for that matter. They believed it was cyclical, more like a wheel, an unending loop of rebirth, followed by corruption, followed by utter destruction, followed by rebirth. In ancient Persia, the Zoroastrians were the first people known to think of the world, life of the world linearly, that the world would have an eventual end. Zoroastrians thought of it more like an arrow, with creation, a corrupt middle, and then eventually a definitive end. This is called, that end, that definitive end, frashokareti, which means making wonderful. In the final conflict in which good prevails over evil, of course, the universe is renovated and the righteous will be reunited with their deity, with the world then being perfect again, wonderful, like it was in the beginning. Forever, the original end of history story. While historians can't link directly the Zoroastrians with the Jews, they expect that their paths must have crossed because the Jews too came to embrace this idea of a definitive beginning and eventual end. Historians believe they likely got the idea from the Persians. Various religions hold apocalyptic beliefs about the end of the world, final battles between good and evil. Within Islam, believers await the messianic figure known as the Mahdi. Mahdi is the rightly guided one, who is believed to appear near the end of times to rid the world of evil and injustice, a savior figure who will fight against tyranny before the day of judgment and restore righteousness on earth. It is expected that Mahdi will be a descendant of the prophet Muhammad. There's the Norse myth of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, preceded by a 3-year-long mighty winter where snow will fall from every direction with no intervening summers and wars will rage. A throng of evil monsters will be unleashed who battle the gods to the death. Without protection from the gods, the sun will turn black and the seas will rise, swallowing humanity. Before both of these stories, though, they emerged a long time after Christianity's book of Revelation. And it is the Christian tale of apocalypse that is the source of Western tales that come in and time again in art, literature, music, video games, television, music, movies, even though many of the artists and writers do not take the Bible literally. Revelation is considered by many to be the most important text about the end of the world by far. For many Christians, of course, it is the authentic word of God through the Apostle John, and more about that in a moment. Some others call it a masterpiece of propaganda. St. Augustine wrote about how confusing this book was and chose to view it allegorically. George Bernard Shaw described it as the curious visions of a drug addict. Thomas Jefferson stated, merely the ravings of a maniac. Excuse me. Personally, I can't decide between propaganda and lunacy. I've tried to read it several times, but settle on possibly a combination of both. Historians believe Babylon to be Rome, the 7 heads of the beast, Rome's 7 hills, the mark of the beast, Roman coinage, the beast himself, the Emperor Nero. For our purposes this morning, let's merely consider it a story jam-packed with ciphers, characters, scenarios, images, and phrases, well-known phrases. The 7 seals, Alpha and Omega, the Battle of Armageddon, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the Whore of Babylon, the number 666, the grapes of wrath, Besides novels, poems, movies, music, video games, TV shows, and paintings, the Book of Revelation also gave us Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. Howe gave us the original 1870 pacifist Mother's Day Proclamation. She was an advocate for abolition, a suffragette, and a Unitarian. But she used imagery from the Book of Revelation in the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In the Bible, the phrase grapes of wrath is a metaphor for God's anger and punishment of evil on earth. It is also, of course, where Steinbeck took the title of his famous novel. Dorian Lynskey, in his extensively researched 2024 nonfiction book, Everything Must Go, Stories We Tell Ourselves About the End of the World, he writes, Revelation gives the Bible a narrative arc, giving humanity's story a theatrical finale, rescuing believers from our endless, messy human history by giving us a past, present, and future that has a message and an ending. Everything happens then for a reason. It acquires significance, right? Whether good or evil, because the believer belongs to that lucky final generation that will experience closure. If John of Patmos, whom most historians believe to be the Book of Revelation's author, not John the Apostle, if John of Patmos had not been mistaken for John the Apostle, that book likely would not have made it into the canon, likely would not have made it into the New Testament. That book of end times with its violent, manic visions. Can you imagine it, the Bible without it? John of Patmos, though, was writing about his own time and expected the end of the world imminently, in his time, not some distant future. And Jesus himself arrived at a time when the Roman-occupied province of Judea was filled with would-be messiahs and apocalyptic sects, with Jesus and Christianity proving to be the most successful, with Jesus quoting from the book of Daniel with its prophecies of wars, earthquakes, and famines as markers of the coming tribulation, which would be followed by the return of the Son of Man and the day of judgment. Jesus himself said, this generation, meaning his generation, this generation shall not pass until all these things be done. And John of Patmos built on those Jesus is saying in the book of Revelation. Most folks around that time, including Jesus and John of Patmos, expected the end of the world imminently. And despite Jesus himself saying, but of that time, of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father. This hasn't stopped Christians from trying to decipher the final day ever since. Revelation is packed with numerology, which believers use, along with those in the book of Daniel, to determine the timetable for the end of the world, attempting to reconcile those with the world lasting for 6,000 years, for those that believe that the 6 days of creation represented the years of the age of the earth. The flexibility about which number you use and which date you start counting from has inspired over 2,000 years of attempts to draw up the doomsday itself, the end of the world. And there's thousands of examples of that. We'll just read a few this morning. In 1662, clergyman Michael Wigglesworth published the American colony's first ever bestseller, an epic poem entitled The Day of Doom. According to historian Perry Miller, it was read by every household in New England for 100 years. In 1832, this is 170 years later, the Reverend William Miller said, after doing his own research, there's a phrase we've come to know lately, isn't it? Reverend William Miller said, I am compelled to believe that this world has about reached the limits of the period allotted for its continuance. Miller preached throughout New England and accumulated a very large following called Millerites. His ideas spread across the America. Most American Protestants then expected a grand event about 1843, which, as Miller predicted, and he tweaked his date a few times, as most of them do, But many Millerites quit their jobs, abandoned their businesses, sold off all their worldly goods. One business owner put up a sign, "This shop is closed in honor of the King of Kings who will appear about the 20th of October. Get ready, friends, to crown him Lord of all." Well, the Great Disappointment, as it came to be known, was widely reported and ridiculed and discouraged date setting for decades. But one newspaper of the times predicted that the fatal delusion of the follies of 1843 will continue because the gullibility of the people remains. Their prediction was true, of course, with many Christians to this day still believing in the book of Revelation, merely feeling it just needs better readers or interpreters. An interesting aside about the Millerites: after the Great Disappointment, the movement split and split again, and then split again, with a teenage Millerite named Ellen Harmon founding the end times focused Seventh-day Adventists in 1863. End time prophecies are also central to the Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, as well as the Jehovah's Witnesses. When the original Millerites split into two factions, one just felt that things needed to get a little worse before Jesus would return. The other focused on another passage of the New Testament, of Revelation, which stated Jesus wouldn't return until Christians established the reign of saints on earth. So they dedicated themselves to making the world a better place. So some believe the millennium would come in a sudden awful ruin, and others by blessedness and peace. The former railed against the New Deal and the League of Nations. If you are looking for signs of the times, there will always be enough misery and political events to support your theory. The seismologist Charles Francis Richter, yes, that Richter, quoted Christ himself that there will always be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places, and then quipped, "Assuredly, no safer forecast was ever made." Our Unitarian forebear, Michael Servetus, we were just talking about him a few weeks ago, he too expected the imminent end of the world, as did another famous anti-Trinitarian, Isaac Newton. While Newton considered the concept of the Trinity the great apostasy, he was in fact a fiend for revelation, stating the last age is now approaching. He wrote in a private notebook for over 50 years about the end times, tweaking his own date and coming up with new dates. His close friends knew about it, and he directed them to let his notebook go public after his death, and not before. Another Unitarian forebear, Joseph Priestley, the chemist who discovered oxygen, he believed the revolutions in France and America heralded the beginning of the end times. On a personal note, a few decades ago, at the beginning of my guidance counselor days, I led a career guidance counseling group at a local high school. One of the girls in my group refused to consider any career choices. Her evangelical pastor preached the end days were coming soon, and she would be one of those raptured up into heaven. This was going to occur, her preacher told her, before she graduated high school, so she didn't need to worry about her future. Historian Richard Hofstadter wrote in a 1964 essay, "Revelation is in the lifeblood of American conspiracy theories, holding both a distinctly American blend of exceptionalistic optimism and violent paranoia." His quote continues, "The enemy within entered the Republic as early as the anti-Illuminati panic of the 1790s. Linsky makes the case for Revelation as the original conspiracy theory, in which secret knowledge is revealed to the righteous few who are wise enough to decipher it, and the forces of good defeat evil once and for all." Charles Manson's family, Jim Jones's People's Temple, David Koresh's Branch Davidians, a splinter of Seventh-day Adventists. QAnon, essentially apocalyptic cults all, with a prophet foretelling a storm endlessly deferred, which will wipe out the evildoers. Totalitarianism demands apocalyptic myths of a golden past and a cursed present and a glorious future. Dorian Linsky reminds us the book of Revelation is dangerous. Religious liberals and secularists are not immune from this end of time fantasizing. But what does the end of time, the world look like for us? Well, from a purely scientific viewpoint, we know the world will end. Between 5 billion and 8 billion years from now, our sun will run out of hydrogen, expand into a red giant 200 times its present size, and swallow the nearest planets, probably including ours. But much sooner than that, perhaps only a mere billion years or so from now, the sun will generate so much heat, the oceans will evaporate, the land will burn, and our earth will become unsurvivably hot. So the world is ending eventually. But all of us, religious liberals and religious conservatives, and we religious liberals and secularists, have closer, more pressing fears about the end of humanity. According to a 2023 YouGov poll, about 2/3 of Americans are at least somewhat concerned about nuclear weapons ending humanity, and we're equally concerned about world war. 53% a pandemic, 52% climate change. Nearly half of Americans are concerned about the possibility that AI, artificial intelligence, will cause the end of the human race on Earth, perceiving AI also as a major threat. And people who use AI tools more often have greater levels of concern than people who do not use AI tools. Our age makes a big difference on how likely we are to think the world is ending. Adults under 30 are more than twice as likely as Americans 65 and older to be at least somewhat concerned about the possibility of the end of the human race on Earth. Slightly more than half of us think the world is likely to end within the next 1,000 years. And the younger we are, the more likely we are to expect the end of the human race to come within the next 100 years, or even the next 10. 18% believe it will happen within the next decade. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists have maintained a symbolic timepiece, the doomsday clock, since 1947. The clock was set a second closer to midnight just 2 months ago. It is now 89 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been, due to climate change, to climate crisis, COVID-19, disruptive technologies like AI, rising authoritarianism, and revenant menace of nuclear war arising from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Their website says, because the world is already perilously close to a precipice, a move of even a single second should be taken as an indication of extreme danger and an unmistakable warning that every second in delay in reversing course increases the probability of global disaster. This might be the most chilling part that's on their website, the next sentence. The bulletin says that the United States, Russia, and China have the primary responsibility to pull the world back from the brink. Not a very hopeful statement, is it? Frank Kermode wrote in 1967, "We need fictions of beginnings and fictions of ends in order to make sense of life, fictions that unite the beginning and the end. And even if we're not religious, we like to think of our own time as being unique, a crucial turning point. We like to tidy the mystery of the future into a story. Many of our stories turn fear into entertainment and thus allow us to participate in the fantasy of living through one's own death and the death of our cities, the destruction of humanity itself. End of the world stories create a feedback loop between fiction and reality. The fictional characters in our stories will often use real events to make sense of their fictional tribulations. Whatever we believe in, climate change, the rapture, we're all storytellers. We feel our own fears are valid and urgent. Theirs are hysterical and delusions. Fear can be dangerous. Yes, it can at times galvanize us, but it can also paralyze us or derange us. Linsky writes that while he doesn't want to diminish the importance of our current crises, he does want to remind us that the anxieties of earlier generations felt no less profound. He writes, "We are not inclined to appreciate the bad things that have not happened to us, the conflicts and famines avoided, the diseases prevented, the lives saved. There have always been doomers." Linsky says our time is different, though, because our apocalyptic angst has become a constant, all flow and no ebb, likely because we absorb news constantly, and it's mostly bad news, and this is more than any other time prior. It is almost inevitable to feel a sense of overwhelm. I know I do. I love this quote. "My desire to be informed is currently at odds with my desire to stay sane." I have that pinned to the top of my Facebook page. And while I don't feel the end of humanity is coming very soon, I do worry that we're quite possibly living in the last days of our democracy, our republic. Britt Ray's 2023 book, Generation Dread, Feeling Purpose in an Age of Climate Anxiety, reflects the view that things are overwhelming and our responses are futile. Britt, a scientist and expert on the psychological impacts of the climate crisis, reminds us that our distress is a sign of our connection to and love for the world, and urges us to recognize our feelings as a sign of our humanity and empathy. When considering all the potential apocalypses, anti-apocalypticists, say that word 3 times fast, I dare you. Anti-apocalypticists claim that those fears of nuclear war, a Y2K meltdown, multiple 9/11s, a swine flu epidemic, a shredded ozone layer, none of these have materialized, that all those folks were crying wolf. The counterclaim, of course, is that the wolf is often at the door in one form or another. In the children's story, Henny Penny or Chicken Little, an acorn falls on her head and she runs around shouting, "The sky is falling, the sky is falling." We actually have that story on our shelf at home. This story has many versions around the world. Sometimes Henny Penny and Chicken Little are the same character, sometimes separate characters. How many of you remember this story? Yeah, I figured most of you would know it. We had this version on our shelf. It's actually up here. It was a gift to our sister Peggy when she turned 3 from our paternal grandparents. The story of Henny Penny. How many of you remember how it ends? She's trying to get to the king, right, to tell him the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Well, the sky wasn't falling, but they all got eaten in the end by the fox. That's the reason we didn't have Doreen read that version this morning. I like the Buddha's version better. That version that Doreen read this morning, that version of Henny Penny, is the oldest known version of that story. It's from 25 centuries ago, from the Dadabak Chitaka, the sound the hare heard. The fable teaches the necessity for deductive reasoning and subsequent investigation, and would have included further action if necessary. Our fears regarding those predicted but failed devastations inspired actions, including deductive reasoning and investigation, that averted those catastrophes. And reason, investigation, and action will be needed often, over and over again, to ward off others. One definitive fact about the end of the world, despite the numerous predictions, is that it has not happened yet. And may we all work together to continue that. Thank you.